Alabama has always carried a rhythm of its own, slow, heavy, and steeped in tradition. In the small town of Evergreen, Sundays still meant church bells echoing through the pines, neighbors waving from front porches, and everyone knowing everyone else's business. To live here was to breathe a certain kind of pride in family, pride in faith, pride in reputation. And for a man like Ebenezer Pews, reputation was everything. At 52, Ebenezer was a fixture of his community. Broad-shouldered from years of working as a mechanic, his hands were scarred with grease and grit. He wasn't a man of many words, but when he spoke, people listened. He held himself like someone who had lived by the same code all his life. Hard work, loyalty, and the unshakable belief that a man's word was his bond. He'd grown up in Alabama, raised on barbecue, football, and Sunday sermons that thundered about sin and salvation. To neighbors, he was a man who embodied Southern tradition. And then there was Letitia Pews, his wife of 15 years. If Ebenezer was the solid oak, Letitia was the soft wind that calmed him. She was gentle, graceful, with a quiet strength in the way she managed their home. To outsiders, she seemed like the perfect Southern wife, always smiling at church gatherings, always the first to bring a casserole when someone fell ill, always devoted to her husband. People would often whisper about how Ebenezer had gotten lucky, marrying a woman like her. And in many ways, he believed it too. But Letitia carried a secret so carefully tucked away it had survived 15 years of marriage, countless Sunday dinners, and endless conversations by the fire. A secret that, if revealed, could shatter not just their marriage, but Ebenezer's entire identity as a man. In their modest home on Magnolia Street, evenings often ended quietly. The kitchen smelled of cornbread and fried catfish. The ceiling fan creaked overhead, and the couple would sit together in silence. Ebenezer, sipping sweet tea, Letitia, folding laundry with her delicate hands. To anyone else, it was the picture of ordinary Southern life. But on one particular evening, something in Letitia's voice carried a tremor, as if her heart were rehearsing words it had never dared to speak. "Ben," she said softly, looking at him across the kitchen table, "do you ever regret marrying me?" Ebenezer looked up, startled. His face, lined from years under the Alabama sun, softened into a rare smile. "Regret?" He chuckled. "Darlin', you're the best thing that's ever happened to me. Don't you go doubting that." Letitia nodded, but her eyes glistened, almost as if she wanted to say more. Instead, she looked down at the folded shirts in her lap, her lips pressing into a thin line. Ebenezer didn't notice. Or maybe he didn't want to. Because in truth, their marriage wasn't flawless. Ebenezer carried a temper, one fueled by a stubborn pride that sometimes cut deeper than he intended. He hated lies. He hated being made a fool of. And though Letitia loved him fiercely, she knew that if the truth of her past ever came out, it would not only test their marriage, it might destroy him. And then there was Dr. Nefertiti Banks, the town's respected gynecologist. Elegant, ambitious, and sharp as a razor, she had known the Pews for years. Many women trusted her with their deepest concerns, their most intimate truths. But behind the polished professionalism, Banks harbored feelings of her own, complicated, tangled feelings for Ebenezer. She admired his strength, envied Letitia's hold on him, and in her heart nursed a bitter jealousy she disguised with a professional smile. All these threads, love, pride, secrets, jealousy, were quietly weaving together, waiting for a single spark to ignite them. The spark came on a warm Tuesday morning in late spring. The air outside smelled of honeysuckle, and the cicadas buzzed lazily in the trees. Letitia had a routine checkup scheduled at Dr. Banks' office. Normally, she would have gone alone, but Ebenezer decided to come along. He said it was because he had the day off and wanted to spend time with her. But deep down, he simply liked knowing what was happening in his wife's world. As they drove down the highway in his old Ford pickup, Letitia kept her hands folded in her lap. She stared out the window, the sunlight catching the edge of her hair, her stomach tight with unease. She wasn't sick, but something about this visit gnawed at her. She knew Dr. Banks. She knew the way the woman looked at Ebenezer when she thought no one noticed. And Letitia feared that sometimes the wrong truth slipped from the wrong lips. Ebenezer, oblivious to his wife's tension, hummed along to an old country tune on the radio. To him, it was just another day. Another checkup. Another ordinary routine in their life together. But it wouldn't be. When the Pews walked through the glass doors of Dr. Banks' office that day, neither of them could have imagined how quickly their world was about to unravel. The waiting room smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender air freshener, a thin attempt to make a gynecologist's office feel welcoming. Magazines sat in neat piles on the table, their glossy covers smiling with pictures of perfect families. Letitia sat stiffly in her chair, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles whitened. Beside her, Ebenezer leaned back, arms crossed over his chest, looking as out of place as a man could possibly feel in a room designed for women. "Won't be long now," Letitia murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Ebenezer grunted. He glanced around at the pastel walls, the quiet hum of a ceiling fan. He was already impatient. "Hope so," he said. "Can't stand sitting in places like this." When the nurse finally called Letitia's name, Ebenezer stood as well, surprising his wife. He wasn't usually the type to follow her into appointments. But today, maybe out of boredom or maybe just pride, he walked in with her. The exam room was cool, sterile. Medical posters of female anatomy lined the walls. Ebenezer shifted uncomfortably, his eyes drifting over diagrams he didn't want to understand. Letitia climbed onto the exam table, trying to calm her racing heart. Moments later, the door opened. Dr. Nefertiti Banks stepped inside. Her presence filled the small room. She was dressed in a tailored white coat, her dark hair pulled back neatly, her heels clicking against the tile floor. She carried herself like a woman in complete control, though her eyes flickered with a sharpness that always seemed to pierce deeper than necessary. "Well, Letitia," Dr. Banks said, her tone professional but cool. "Good to see you again. And Mr. Pews, I didn't expect you today." Ebenezer nodded curtly. "Figured I'd come along. Keep an eye on things." The words hung heavy, and Letitia's chest tightened. Dr. Banks arched a brow but didn't comment. She flipped through Letitia's chart, her fingers lingering on the papers a moment too long, as though she'd been waiting for this opportunity. The examination began routinely, blood pressure, a few quick questions. But then Dr. Banks' voice shifted, deliberate, cutting. She said, almost to herself. "Interesting." Letitia froze. Her eyes darted to the doctor's face. "What is it?" Dr. Banks looked directly at Ebenezer, as though her patient wasn't even in the room. "It's unusual," she said smoothly. "Your wife doesn't have a uterus." The air left the room in a single, silent beat. Ebenezer blinked, not sure he'd heard correctly. "What the hell did you just say?" Letitia's hands shot up, trembling. "Please, Dr. Banks." But Banks cut her off, her words like shards of glass. She never had one, and certain markers in her file. "Well, I'm afraid it suggests she was not born biologically female." For a moment, Ebenezer couldn't breathe. His ears rang, his chest felt like it was caving in. He stared at his wife, the woman he had shared a bed with for 15 years, the woman he had called his bride, his partner, his world. His voice cracked as he whispered, "Letty, tell me it ain't true." Letitia's eyes brimmed with tears. She reached for him, desperate. "Ben, please, let me explain." But Ebenezer jerked away, his body shaking. "Explain." His voice roared through the sterile room. "Explain how I've been married to a man for 15 damn years." The nurse outside startled at the sound, but no one entered. Inside, Letitia collapsed into sobs, her words tumbling over each other. "I was born different, yes, but I became who I am long before I met you. I didn't tell you because I was terrified. I loved you too much to lose you." Ebenezer's face twisted, torn between rage and disbelief. He slammed a hand against the wall so hard the medical chart rattled. "You lied to me. You made me a fool." Dr. Banks stood silent, her lips curling almost imperceptibly. She had said what she wanted to say. She had planted the seed of destruction. Now she watched it grow. Letitia crawled off the exam table, her voice breaking. "Ben, everything we've had is real. The meals, the prayers, the laughter, it was all real. I may have hidden my past, but my love for you has never been a lie." Her words were raw, desperate, but Ebenezer only shook his head violently, his chest heaving like a man drowning. "Don't you dare call it love," he spat. The room felt too small, the air too thick. Letitia tried to move closer, but Ebenezer shoved past her, pacing like a caged animal. His eyes burned, his pride shredded. "You took away my choice," he growled. You took away the truth. 15 years. You let me walk around town like some goddamn fool, not even knowing the woman on my arm wasn't even. He couldn't finish the sentence. His voice cracked under the weight of it. Letitia reached for him one last time, her fingers brushing his arm. Please, don't let this destroy us. I'm still me. I'm still the woman you love. Ebenezer ripped his arm away, his voice breaking into a shout that made the windows tremble. No, you're not who I thought you were. The silence that followed was deafening. The nurse had vanished. Even the hum of the ceiling fan seemed to stop. Then, without another word, Letitia bolted. She pushed open the door, tears blinding her, and fled down the hallway. Her heels clattered against the linoleum, the sound echoing like a countdown. For a second, Ebenezer stood frozen. His heart hammered, his hands shaking, his vision blurred red. And then something in him snapped. He stormed after her, his boots pounding against the floor, his voice thundering. Letty, you come back here. Dr. Banks stood in the doorway, watching with cold satisfaction as the Pews' marriage, their entire life together, collapsed in the span of minutes. She didn't move to stop him. She didn't call for help. She simply whispered under her breath, almost smiling. Some truths were meant to be told. And with that, the storm had broken. The hallway echoed with chaos. Nurses glanced up from their stations as Letitia tore past them, her heels clattering on the linoleum, her sobs breaking the sterile silence of the clinic. She wasn't just running from her husband. She was running from the truth that had finally caught her. Behind her, Ebenezer's boots thundered like war drums. His voice roared through the corridor, raw and guttural. Letty, don't you run from me. Patience froze, wide-eyed, as the tall mechanic stormed past, his face twisted in fury. The sight of his broad frame bearing down the hallway was enough to make one mother clutch her child closer. But Letitia didn't look back. She pushed through the glass doors into the humid Alabama afternoon, desperate for air, desperate for escape. The sun was blinding, the heat heavy. She stumbled into the parking lot, weaving between cars, her breaths ragged. Please, God, she whispered, don't let it end like this. But Ebenezer was only steps behind. The veins in his neck pulsed as sweat streamed down his temples. Each step carried the weight of betrayal, of pride torn to shreds. In his mind, 15 years of laughter and love had just curdled into humiliation. Every whisper of the town, every handshake at the church, every fine couple you two make, he now saw it as a cruel joke. Stop, Letty, he bellowed. She turned the corner at the edge of the clinic, her eyes searching wildly for somewhere, anywhere, to hide. That's when she spotted it, a narrow alley between the clinic and a storage building. She darted inside, the cool shadows swallowing her up. The alley smelled of damp brick and garbage. A flickering light buzzed above, casting fractured shadows along the walls. Letitia pressed herself against the cold bricks, her chest rising and falling in frantic gasps. Moments later, Ebenezer appeared at the mouth of the alley, his silhouette filling the narrow passage. His hand rested on his hip, where the outline of his revolver bulged beneath his shirt. His eyes locked on her, wild and burning. Why, Letty? He rasped, his voice trembling with rage and heartbreak. Why didn't you tell me? Letitia raised her hands, palms trembling. Her mascara streaked down her face, but her eyes glistened with something more than fear. It was love, desperate and unyielding. I was afraid, she cried. I wanted you to see me as I am, not as I was. I thought if I told you, I'd lose you forever. Then, everything we had, it was real. Ebenezer shook his head violently, the gun now in his hand though he hadn't realized pulling it free. His knuckles whitened around the handle. Real? You call this real? You made me into a fool, Letty. A fool in front of God, in front of everybody in this town. She stepped closer, her voice breaking. No, you're not a fool. You're my husband. You're the man I chose, the man I love. Please, don't let pride take this from us. Don't let anger destroy us. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, a hesitation, a ghost of the man who once held her hand at church picnics, who once promised her forever. But the weight of humiliation pressed harder, crushing that moment of mercy. You should have trusted me, he growled, his voice cracking. But instead, you let me live a lie. And now, I can't forgive you. Letitia's chest heaved. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she whispered, then at least remember this. I loved you every single day. The gunshot cracked like thunder. Letitia crumpled to the ground, her body folding gently as though sleep had taken her. Her eyes, wide with pain and sorrow, searched for his face one last time. Her lips quivered, releasing her final breath. "I just wanted you to love me as I am." Ebenezer stood frozen, the revolver still smoking in his trembling hands. The echo of the shot bounced between the brick walls, fading into silence. His chest heaved, his face pale, as though he himself had been struck. For a long moment, he stared at her body lying still on the cold concrete. The woman who had shared his home, his meals, his laughter, now gone because of one secret, one truth, one moment he couldn't control. The rage drained out of him, leaving only horror. His knees buckled, and he dropped beside her, clutching his head in his hands. "What have I done?" he whispered, over and over, rocking back and forth as sirens wailed in the distance. The cicadas still buzzed in the trees. The sun still burned overhead. But in that narrow alley, time had stopped. The sirens grew louder, cutting through the thick Alabama air as neighbors gathered at the mouth of the alley. Some gasped, some clutched their mouths, others whispered in disbelief. Ebenezer sat slumped against the brick wall, his broad shoulders heaving, his hands still stained with the smoke of the revolver. Letitia's body lay only a few feet away, her eyes still open to the sky, as if she were silently asking heaven why love had turned into death. When the patrol cars screeched to a halt, officers poured out, weapons drawn, their voices sharp and commanding. "Hands where we can see him." "Now," one shouted. Ebenezer didn't resist. His arms lifted slowly, trembling, as though the weight of his sin made even that simple act unbearable. The revolver was kicked across the concrete. He was hauled to his feet, wrists bound in steel, and led away past the murmuring crowd. His neighbors, people who'd once shaken his hand outside church, who'd called him a good man, now looked at him as though he were a monster. The shame in his eyes was worse than the cuffs around his wrists. Detective Obadiah Willis was called to the scene within the hour. He was a seasoned man, gray at the temples, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had seen too much but never stopped caring. He stepped into the alley with a grim expression, the soles of his shoes splashing through a puddle where blood had trickled. He paused at Letitia's side, removing his hat, bowing his head for a moment of silence. Then he turned to the officers. "Tell me what happened." The story was relayed in clipped tones. A fight inside Dr. Banks' office, the wife running, the husband chasing, the single gunshot in the alley. On paper it was straightforward, but Willis had lived long enough to know nothing in small towns was ever that simple. He crouched beside Letitia's body, studying her face. There was something almost peaceful about her features, as though the last words on her lips had been love rather than fear. That detail clung to him, refusing to let go. He stood and surveyed the alley again, eyes narrowing. Later, at the precinct, Ebenezer sat hunched over the cold metal table in the interrogation room. His hands trembled as he spoke, voice raw and hollow. "She lied to me," he muttered. 15 years, lied to me about everything. Willis studied him carefully, noting the red-rimmed eyes, the way his voice cracked. This wasn't a man celebrating vengeance. This was a man drowning in devastation. "You shot your wife?" Willis said evenly. But was it anger, or was it someone else feeding that anger? Ebenezer's head lifted slowly. "You don't understand," he whispered. "That doctor, she said it like she wanted me to hear it, like she enjoyed watching me break." The detective leaned back, his instincts sharpening. He had already spoken briefly with Dr. Nefertiti Banks, and something about her demeanor had unsettled him. Too calm, too detached. Her words carried no trace of remorse for the way she'd shattered the Pews marriage in the middle of a medical appointment. That evening, Willis visited the clinic himself. The exam room was still in disarray, papers scattered, a chair tipped over, the air heavy with what had been said inside those walls. He imagined Letitia's tears, Ebenezer's fury, Banks standing there with that cool, clinical look. His gut told him this wasn't just a tragedy of passion, it was a tragedy provoked. When he confronted Dr. Banks in her office, she sat behind her polished desk, lips pressed into a thin line. "Detective, I did my job," she said smoothly. "I told the truth. What happened after that is not my responsibility." Willis paced the room slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "You revealed confidential medical history in front of her husband. You knew how volatile that could be. You didn't protect your patient. You lit the match and walked away. Her eyes flickered, just for a second, before her composure returned. Are you suggesting I'm to blame for Mr. Pew's choices? I'm suggesting, Willis replied quietly, that you wanted this to happen. Banks leaned forward, her voice sharpening. I've dedicated my life to medicine. Don't insult me with baseless accusations. But Willis wasn't convinced. He had seen jealousy dressed as professionalism before, and he had already uncovered the late-night text messages between her and Ebenezer. Messages that blurred the lines between concern and desire. She wasn't just Letitia's doctor. She was a woman who had wanted Ebenezer for herself. Back at the station, Willis pieced the threads together. The affair hadn't happened, but the longing had. Banks had the motive, jealousy. She had the opportunity, access to Letitia's most private secrets. And she had the weapon, not of bullets, but of words sharpened into daggers. When he returned to the holding cell, Ebenezer sat with his head in his hands. I didn't mean to do it, he whispered. I couldn't take it. Everything she said, everything I thought I knew, gone in a second. Willis studied him, torn between duty and empathy. Yes, Ebenezer had pulled the trigger. But he wasn't the only guilty party in this story. Another hand had nudged him closer to the edge. Another voice had whispered poison into his ears. And in Alabama, where secrets travel faster than light, Willis knew this case would divide the town. Some would call it murder. Others would call it provoked. But everyone would remember it as the day a doctor's words killed faster than a gun. The courthouse in Evergreen, Alabama, had seen its share of cases over the decades. Land disputes, petty theft, the occasional drunken brawl that turned bloody. But nothing like this. By the time the trial of State versus Ebenezer Pew began, the story had spread far beyond the county line. News vans lined the streets, their satellite dishes aimed toward the heavens. Strangers packed into the gallery, hungry for every word. To them, it wasn't just a trial. It was a spectacle, a tale of secrets, betrayal, and a husband driven to murder. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick enough to choke on. Wooden pews creaked under the weight of bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder. Reporters tapped frantically at their laptops. Church ladies fanned themselves, whispering prayers under their breath. And at the center of it all sat Ebenezer, shackled by more than the handcuffs on his wrists. His face had aged years in just weeks. His hair, once salt and pepper, was now streaked with white. His hands trembled as he rubbed them together, a nervous tic that betrayed the storm inside him. Behind the defense table, he looked less like a killer and more like a man already condemned by life. The prosecutor, a sharp-tongued woman from Montgomery named Rachel Whitaker, wasted no time painting the picture she wanted the jury to see. She rose to her feet, heels clicking, voice slicing through the silence. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, pacing deliberately, this case is not about secrets. It is not about betrayal. It is about choice. On that hot spring day, Ebenezer Pew chose to pull the trigger. He chose to end a woman's life. Whatever his reasons, whatever his excuses, he cannot escape the simple fact that he committed murder. Her words hit hard, each syllable landing like a gavel strike. She pointed toward the defense table, her fingers steady and accusing. The law does not bend for humiliation. It does not bend for pride. And it does not bend for men who cannot control their rage. Ebenezer lowered his eyes, shame washing over him. When it was the defense's turn, Attorney Samuel Carter, a graying man with a slow drawl and steady presence, stepped forward. His voice carried the cadence of Southern compassion, appealing not just to the law but to the hearts of the jurors. My client, he said, gesturing to Ebenezer, is a man whose world was ripped apart in the span of a heartbeat. For 15 years, he lived with love and devotion. Then, in one moment, he was told that the foundation of his marriage was built on a secret he never consented to. His reaction was not calculated. It was the eruption of a heart that had been deceived. He let the words sink in before continuing. We are not here to excuse what happened. A life was lost, and that is a tragedy no words can erase. But we are here to understand why. To recognize that Ebenezer did not act as a cold-blooded murderer, but as a broken man, provoked beyond reason. The courtroom buzzed. Some nodded, sympathetic. Others scowled, unwilling to forgive. The witnesses followed. Nurses described the shouting in the exam room, the sound of Ebenezer's voice like thunder. One patient swore she saw him chasing Letitia into the parking lot. The medical examiner detailed the gunshot wound with clinical detachment, each fact another nail in Ebenezer's coffin. But the most explosive testimony came when Detective Obadiah Willis took the stand. His gravelly voice carried the weight of truth. "I've investigated many crimes in my career," he said, locking eyes with the jury, "but I can tell you this. What happened in that exam room wasn't just a husband discovering a secret. It was a husband being pushed to the edge." The prosecutor objected, but the judge allowed him to continue. Willis leaned forward. "Dr. Nefertiti Banks, in my opinion, broke the sacred trust between doctor and patient. She revealed confidential information in front of Mr. Pews, knowing full well it would destroy their marriage. She didn't just state medical facts. She weaponized them. And when Letitia fled, she didn't intervene. She didn't call for help. She let the fire burn." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Dr. Banks sat stiff in her seat, her jaw clenched, her eyes narrowed to slits. Under cross-examination, she defended herself coolly. "I told the truth. I did my duty. If Mr. Pews couldn't handle that truth, that's on him." But the coldness in her voice only deepened the unease. The jury shifted uncomfortably, some exchanging glances. As the trial stretched on, the tension grew unbearable. Each day was a tug-of-war between justice and sympathy, between law and humanity. The prosecution reminded the jury of the revolver, of the deliberate act of pulling the trigger. The defense reminded them of the words spoken in that exam room, of the emotional ambush that shattered a man's sanity. Finally, it came down to closing arguments. Whitaker rose once more, her voice sharp as glass. "If we allow anger to excuse murder, then none of us are safe. We all have secrets. We all have moments of betrayal. But we do not get to kill because of them. The law demands better." Then Carter, his voice low and resonant, made his final plea. "We do not condone what happened, but we ask you to see the man before you, not as a monster, but as someone broken by the cruelty of another. He did not premeditate. He did not plan. He snapped, as any of us might when stripped bare in front of the world." The jury deliberated for hours, the courthouse a hive of restless energy. Outside, the crowd grew thick, people clutching signs that read justice for Letitia while others whispered prayers for Ebenezer. At last, the jurors filed back in, faces unreadable. The foreman stood, clearing his throat. The entire room held its breath. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Ebenezer Pews, guilty of murder in the second degree." The words dropped like stones into water, sending ripples of shock across the room. Some cried out in relief. Others shook their heads in sorrow. Ebenezer closed his eyes, his shoulders slumping as though the last of his strength had drained away. The judge pronounced the sentence: life in prison, without the possibility of parole. In the gallery, Dr. Banks' lips twitched, almost a smile, but quickly flattened when she saw Detective Willis's eyes fixed on her. He knew she had set the tragedy in motion, even if the law couldn't yet touch her. As Ebenezer was led away, chains clinking, he turned his head once toward the empty chair where Letitia should have been. For the first time since the shooting, his lips moved in a whisper, meant only for himself. "I'm sorry, Letty." And then he disappeared through the door, swallowed by the justice system, leaving behind a town that would never forget. The trial was over, but Evergreen would never be the same. The courthouse emptied out, leaving behind echoes of whispered gossip and the faint smell of coffee gone cold. Outside, the air was heavy, as if the town itself carried the weight of what had been decided. People lingered on the courthouse steps, their voices hushed, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others insisting justice had finally been served. For Letitia, there would be no appeals, no second chances. She was buried on a quiet hillside outside town, beneath a magnolia tree that shed blossoms like falling snow. Her funeral was crowded. Neighbors, churchgoers, even strangers who'd only known her story through headlines. Some came out of compassion, others out of curiosity. The preacher spoke of forgiveness, of truth setting us free, but every time he mentioned love, there was a tightening in the pews. Because for many, the question lingered. Was love enough if it was built on silence? Ebenezer wasn't there. Instead, he sat in a concrete cell, the faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. His world had shrunk to a narrow cot, a metal toilet, and four walls that smelled of sweat, and despair. He replayed the moment in the alley every night, the way Letitia's eyes had shone with love even as life slipped away. Her last words echoed louder than the gunshot itself. "I just wanted you to love me as I am." Sometimes he pressed his fists to his temples, rocking back and forth, whispering apologies into the dark. Other times he sat perfectly still, staring at the wall as though waiting for it to collapse and bury him. The anger that had once burned like fire had cooled into ash, leaving only regret. Detective Obadiah Willis, meanwhile, refused to let the case rest. He had done his duty in court, but something about Dr. Banks gnawed at him. She had walked away untouched, her medical license still intact for the moment. But Willis knew better. He had seen the flicker in her eyes when she spoke on the stand, the way her words dripped with cold detachment. To him, she wasn't just a doctor who told the truth. She was an arsonist who lit the match and watched the fire consume. Within weeks, a formal inquiry into Dr. Banks began. The medical board received complaints, not just from Letitia's family, but from other patients who had long felt her professionalism carried a razor's edge of cruelty. The investigation uncovered messages between her and Ebenezer, late-night conversations where she'd hinted that Letitia was hiding something big. That truth always comes out. It was enough to strip her of her license, enough to turn her into a pariah in the very town where she once commanded respect. Still, the punishment felt hollow. It didn't bring Letitia back. It didn't erase the moment Ebenezer lost control. Evergreen moved forward, but not without scars. At Sunday services, Pews seemed emptier. Neighbors looked at one another with more suspicion. Whispers lingered about secrets, about trust, about the thin line between love and betrayal. Parents warned their children about honesty, but in quieter tones, some admitted they feared honesty as much as lies. And then there was Ebenezer. For the rest of his days, he would be a man caught between two truths, that he loved his wife and that he killed her. Each night in his cell, he closed his eyes and saw her face, not the face of a deceiver, but the face of a woman who had loved him in spite of everything. He wept not just for what he had done, but for the man he could have been if only he'd listened instead of pulled the trigger. In Evergreen, the story became legend. It was told in hushed voices in diners, on front porches, in barber shops. Some remembered it as the tale of a man betrayed, others as the tale of a woman silenced. But most told it as a warning, that secrets have a way of finding daylight, and that when they do, the fallout can be deadly. The magnolia tree above Letitia's grave bloomed year after year, its blossoms drifting down like tears. Visitors often left flowers, some scribbled notes folded into the earth. And among them, one letter stood out, a simple piece of paper, smudged with ink and folded many times over. It read only, "I'm sorry, Letty. I loved you more than my pride." Signed with shaky handwriting, Ebenezer. And so the story of Ebenezer and Letitia Pews ended not with closure, but with echoes, a love story twisted into tragedy, a community left haunted, and a reminder that sometimes the deadliest weapon isn't a gun at all, but the truth, spoken without mercy.